The Israeli attack has in fact been planned, even rehearsed, for 8 years.
Before I fly, I leave all my feelings behind. Who I am, my feelings about my loved ones, all of that becomes irrelevant. I focus only on the mission.
Almost the entire Israeli Air Force takes off. The attack is timed to catch the Egyptians at breakfast. It's an all-out assault, aimed at hitting every airbase in Egypt simultaneously. The planes fly low, avoiding Egyptian radar. At each airfield, there is an overall plan. First, disable the runways to prevent escape. Then, take out individual planes.
We climbed, then dived. The Cairo West airfield was burning in front of me. It was cool to see the airfield burning. My target was in front of me. Now to find my Tupolev bombers. Each is the size of a Boeing 707 and intended to bomb Tel Aviv. It was a great feeling to destroy them.
The Israelis achieve total surprise. Egypt's Field Marshal Amer is touring the Sinai to prepare for the coming war, unaware that it has already started.
It was a strange feeling to see the Israeli planes over us. My first impression of the war was when I saw the Israeli planes above me, while I was in the Field Army Command headquarters. Not a single warning siren sounded before their arrival.
I can't say I wasn't expecting what happened, but I didn't imagine it was going to be that bad. Not that bad.
In just 3 hours, the Egyptian Air Force is destroyed. 280 modern jet fighters and bombers lost. It takes only 2 more hours to destroy the Syrian Air Force, and minutes to annihilate the Jordanians. Within the first hours of the war, Israel has destroyed the air power of its enemy and is now able to mount its ground offensive without fear of an Arab air attack.
I gave the coded order, red sheet. It meant that the tanks should raise antennas and begin to move. I heard the order cascading through the communication networks of all the command centers, and we pressed forward.
Israel drives an armored wedge into Egyptian defenses along the 3 roads leading into the Sinai Desert and begins to engage the main body of the Egyptian army. Israeli reservist Yehoshua Bar Dayan sees action in the Sinai, and he keeps a diary.
Now that it's actually happening, there is no fear, only excitement. It seems like chaos. Dozens of tanks and armored trucks are on the move. We're suffocating in the dust.
The Egyptian High Command is in a state of shock. Israel's air attack has been a catastrophe. Without air cover, Egyptian troops at the front begin to panic.
Our officers didn't even have time to order us to dig in. Everything happened so fast. Suddenly, we saw our soldiers withdrawing. Nobody told us what was happening. So we withdrew too.
With both air and ground wars going badly, the Egyptian military's command and communication networks begin to crack. Commanders at headquarters don't know what's happening in the field. But these military disasters are kept from the Egyptian public. Jubilant crowds gather to listen as Radio Cairo announces victories. Each fictitious downed Israeli jet elicits cheers.
All we were allowed to broadcast were the announcements of the General Command. The command was telling of great victories. We have downed dozens of aircraft. Our forces are advancing in the Sinai, and commandos are already in Israeli territory. It gave us the impression we were achieving a great victory.
In Damascus, the Syrian Broadcasting Service is also reporting imaginary conquests.
The President of the Republic came to the TV station to make a speech to the nation. He encouraged the people, telling them that the war had started and that tomorrow we would have lunch in Tel Aviv.
Israel follows its own plan of disinformation. The public has not been told of the total victory of the Israeli air attack. Israelis learn about the war when air raid sirens signal them to go into shelters.
Moshe Dayan, as defense minister, gave an order. He ordered total radio silence on the first day of the war. Not one announcement on what the IDF was doing or its victories.
All the Israeli public hears is a general statement that the war has begun.
The reason for that was the fear of an immediate international intervention that would attempt to impose a ceasefire.
The Soviets soon learn about the war and the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force. At the Kremlin, the Politburo goes into emergency session.
The Politburo was trying to determine its position. Shall we get involved militarily or in some other way? The Israeli army was advancing inside Egypt. The whole situation was getting out of control. We had to decide what to do.
The Politburo opts for a bold stance. It rushes reinforcements to the Egyptian army and orders 41 MiG jet fighters to fly to a staging ground in Armenia. While preparing for war, the Soviets also activate the hotline and contact the White House directly. For this task, the Kremlin summons its foremost English translator, Viktor Sukhodrev.
I was led into a room where I saw not a telephone, but an ordinary teletype machine. And they had rolls of paper, a typewriter-style keyboard. That was it.
Then Premier Kosygin walks in.
Kosygin said, tell the White House that Chairman Kosygin is here at the apparatus and wants to talk to President Johnson.
About 7:15, the telephone rang. It was the duty officer in the war room. Mr. Secretary, Prime Minister Kosygin's on the hotline. He wishes to speak to the president. So the president came on the line. He said, in effect, God damn it, Bob, what are you calling me for at this time in the morning? I said, Mr. President, Prime Minister Kosygin's on the hotline. How do you wish to respond?
Kosygin started dictating. The Israelis were advancing into Egyptian territory, and it was therefore up to Israel's ally and supporter, the United States, to stop the aggression.
President Johnson doesn't want the Soviets to take unilateral military action, nor does he want to become entangled in Israel's war. Johnson writes back immediately. He promises Kosygin to work together with the Soviets in the United Nations and do everything possible to stop the war before it escalates. Radio Cairo's false news about Egyptian military successes has reached Arab Jerusalem, where it has an electrifying effect.
What's the radio saying about what's happened?
23 airmen for Israel.
23?
23 now.
Airplanes?
Yes, airplanes.
What, shut down?
Yes.
By this time, I had left the newspaper and run over to the radio station just to see what was going on. Because all they were doing was broadcasting military music and shouting slogans. And I remember saying to them, they're going to hit this place. And the head of the station saying, because he had some military experience, the head of the station. We were probably the only two people who had military experience. He had served in the Jordan Army. I had served in the American Army. Nobody else. That was the other amazing thing for me. Everybody's clamoring for war, all the young men, and none of them knew how to fire a rifle. And I was cautioned, don't talk that way. You're suggesting that the united might of the Arabs are not going to overwhelm Israel. They're going to come in here. How can you even think that way?
The truth is that on the first day, our morale was very high because all the information we got was that the Arabs were victorious. Israel jammed our military communications, so we were getting all our information from the radio. And the Egyptian Radio Cairo was giving wrong information.
In Amman, Jordan's King Hussein receives a message from Israel.
We appeal to King Hussein and to other neighbors to stay their hand, and Israel would do likewise.
But King Hussein can do little. He has signed a mutual defense treaty with his Arab neighbors, and his army is now under the control of an Egyptian, General Riyad.
We were fighting the war on the basis that it was an Arab joint effort. This is why the Egyptian general's views prevailed.
The Arab war plan calls for the Egyptian and Jordanian armies to cut Israel in half. But neither King Hussein nor General Riyad have any real information about the progress of the war. Just public lies from Radio Cairo and private lies from the very top. Nasser calls the king and tells him that his planes are attacking Israel. He urges Hussein to seize as much territory as possible before a UN ceasefire. Minutes after this phone call, Jordanian guns and mortars start to shell the Israeli half of Jerusalem. This is the first attack on Israeli territory.
They started bringing in hundreds of wounded by ambulance and also by helicopter. There's a helicopter landing field over there.
Only 3 hours into the war with Egypt, the war has now expanded to include Jerusalem. The future of the Holy City, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, will be decided by force of arms in a battle that will resonate for generations. The battle for Jerusalem begins where the 1948 war left off. For close to 20 years, Jerusalem has been a city divided between Jordan and Israel. In his home, Jordanian soldier Badi Awad keeps a prize painting. It depicts how his unit defeated the Israelis in 1948 and captured the Jewish quarter. 19 years later, in 1967, he's back. This time to fight for the demilitarized UN compound.
الهدف
I got a direct order to occupy the UN headquarters south of Jerusalem. I was to secure it from an Israeli incursion.
In the war room, the nerve center of Israel's military command, one man, General Moshe Dayan, defense minister for only 4 days, is making all the critical decisions. His prime concern is to avoid a war on multiple fronts, a potential disaster for the outnumbered Israeli forces. But Jerusalem is a special case. He decides he cannot put the city at risk. He authorizes the Israeli Central Command to engage in the battle for the UN headquarters.
One thing was clear to me. If I could quickly counterattack, I would be successful.
While Colonel Dar's tanks attack the high ground overlooking the headquarters, one platoon forces its way into the compound.
I was giving my orders from the heart of the battle. I was facing the enemy with my soldiers. We were positioned with 2 battalions forward and 1 to the rear in the compound.
By late afternoon, a wounded Asher Dar captures the UN headquarters. Now that a ground war with Jordan has begun, the military must control the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In the war of 1948, that road, which runs through the Latrun Valley, was occupied by the Jordanian Legion. General Moshe Yotvat is assigned to secure the road. Yotvat is no stranger to this place. He fought here twice in 1948. And twice, the Israelis were unable to dislodge the valley's Jordanian defenders.
I was wounded in the battle. The platoon commander was wounded. Ariel Sharon was wounded. Actually, everyone who came out alive was wounded. The rest did not come out alive.
Now, Moshe Yotvat has another chance. He starts shelling the Jordanians. But the Jordanian Legion has withdrawn into the West Bank. Yotvat pursues them. In the war room in Amman, Jordan's military elite is watching disaster unfold. They want to defend and hold Jerusalem as they have done in the past. But their troops are now under the command of an Egyptian general, and he is following orders from Cairo to send Jordan's army away from Jerusalem.
They were shouting and screaming at each other, and they nearly fought because the Jordanians felt this was a battle of destiny for them. It meant the future of the West Bank, and in particular, Jerusalem.
On the second day of the war, with the Sinai campaign going well, Moshe Dayan pulls out his paratroopers from the Egyptian front and sends them to fight in the battle for Jerusalem. Israelis are haunted by the loss of the Jewish quarter in the Old City just 19 years earlier in the 48 war. The quarter was destroyed, its synagogues defiled, and access to the Wailing Wall lost. Jews were exiled from a city where they had lived since the reign of King David 3,000 years before. To many Israelis, this was a national disaster. One of the paratroopers sent from the Sinai to fight in Jerusalem is Hanan Porat.
For me, and not only for me, I finally understood something. The war was changing direction. It was no longer a war for survival, a defensive war against jihad, but a war which, even if we didn't express it this way, had become a war of redemption. I remember how we went up to Jerusalem in these dusty buses. The buses roaring with the song, Jerusalem of Gold. The guys are singing about how the water holes have dried up, how nobody comes anymore to visit the town square. I mean, who thought about those things back then?
The song, Jerusalem of Gold, was written just before the war. It's an unlikely anthem for the soldiers, most of them secular Jews who have always regarded Tel Aviv as their center. But the war is changing Israel. The largely secular nation is getting a heady dose of religion, and the battle for Jerusalem is starting to feel like another holy war. That night, the Israelis begin a determined ground offensive. The soldiers are paratroopers, like Private Yaki Hetz, fighting for the ridge overlooking the old city.
I felt there was no earth underneath me, like I'm walking through water. I shoot just to get my confidence back.
Ghazi Rubaya commands a company of the Jordanian army assigned to protect the ridge.
I had two options. Either my soldiers get killed, or I find a way out of here. What shall I do? The Jews are coming from all sides. The spirit of my soldiers is at its lowest.
The Jordanian resistance is broken after 5 hours of fierce fighting. 105 Jordanians and 35 Israelis die, 18 of them from Yaki Hetz's platoon.
I was in shock. I tried to understand what happened. For me, it was a war of survival. I never took part in any of the celebrations. Even a year later, I couldn't listen to the music that celebrated the victory. I refused to listen to Jerusalem of Gold. I had to turn the radio off. I was in despair. This war was a terrible blow.
Those who listen to my story of the war may not realize the scope of the tragedy, the fierceness of the battle, the fear, the hunger, the pain, the responsibility. Defeat is bitter. Its psychological effects stayed with us for a very long time.
With the defeat of the Jordanians who were defending the approaches to the city, the Israelis prepare to move in. Abdullah Schleifer is there to witness the beginning of the fall of the old city.
I saw one airplane that swept low, clearing the Dome of the Rock, and then as it moved upward, it dropped the bombs that wiped out the last Jordanian military positions that were defending the approach to the old city.
By morning, most of the Jordanian defenders in Old Jerusalem are gone.
On the third day, about 600 or 700 people came to us in the Aqsa Mosque, asking us to withdraw. I don't blame them. They saw tanks in the streets.
and they were under the influence of Israel's psychological warfare.
A few stayed on the walls to fight. A few militiamen and a few Jordanian soldiers who decided they were going to stay and die here. They stayed on the walls, and there was even a unit, a sergeant and two of his men, who were with the Jordanian army as it left the city. And by the time it got to the other side of the valley, they looked back, the sun was rising, and they saw the sun sparkling on the dome. And they were so moved by this sight. Usually when people desert, they desert to go away from war. These men deserted to come back and fight.
We arrived here late in the morning. We came down from Augusta Victoria through the Kidron Valley and climbed towards the Lion's Gate. We felt that we were making history, that we were writing a new chapter in the Bible.
Suddenly I heard tremendous shouts, and I realized that the Israelis had entered the city. You know, tremendous shouts of victory and exultation and firing. You could see Israeli troops fanning out in the Haram Sharif, and you could see the prisoners were being taken, and they were obviously notables of the city, because this Haram was the last command post for the governor, for what there was of a civilian command.
From the Temple Mount, the soldiers find a small gate that leads to the Wailing Wall. Even young secular Israelis get caught up in the religious frenzy.
Near me, I can see a kibbutz member from a left-wing kibbutz, and he is asking me, Hanan, what prayer do you say here? I tell him, pray. But I do not know how to pray, he answers. Say Shema Israel. And he tells me, I do not know how to say it. I told him, repeat after me. And he repeated, shouting, Shema, listen, our God of Israel. Believe me, I do not know if I ever heard such a prayer in my life.
I'm standing there with my family holding my American passport, and I'm saying, I'm an American, I'm an American. And they're shouting, the roof, in English. They want to get out of the roof because there's still some sniping. And then it's in every Israeli history book. They come up to hang the flag.
Israeli soldiers capture the euphoric moment on home movie cameras. The Israelis have taken the old city of Jerusalem. They have, in their view, liberated one of Judaism's holiest sites, the remains of the Second Temple. But at the same time, they have occupied one of the Muslim world's holiest places, the Haram al-Sharif, or Noble Sanctuary. This tragic intersection of religious geography will stoke the fires of conflict for generations to come. And it will be a deep and humiliating setback for Jordan's king.
King Hussein has always perceived himself as a Hashemite leader. He's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And the protection of the Jerusalem Muslim shrines was the responsibility of the Hashemites. And history would register that they were lost during his time.
If we are going to live, we will live with honor. If we don't make it, we will die with honor. For our nation, for our rights, and for all times.
The conquering generals of the Israeli army, Moshe Dayan, Uzi Narkis, and Yitzhak Rabin, proudly enter the city they've captured. They are careful to record the moment.
We advanced about 10 meters past the gate when Dayan stopped the group and said, Ilan, please go forward and take a picture of me entering the old city. These were his exact words.
It is to be a purely military triumph. Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol is absent. He has been told it's too dangerous for him to come. There's only room for Israel's heroes of the moment, the military. By the second day of the war, the Israeli army in the West Bank is fighting so well and moving so fast that it has outrun civilian control. Even the Army High Command is leaving critical decisions to local commanders. General Moshe Yotvat moves into the West Bank and pushes through to the Jordan Valley.
I was just taking advantage of opportunities as they came. And this is how it happened in every place we took on the West Bank. It just rolled from one phase to the next. There was no plan. Yes, there were operation plans from before, but there was no overall plan to occupy the West Bank, period.
In the Sinai, the Israelis are also doing better than they expected. General Ariel Sharon surprises the Egyptians when he crosses sand dunes previously considered impassable. He orders his artillery to make the earth shake. For the Arab armies, the war has been one defeat after another. If their leaders are to survive this calamity, they must shift the blame somewhere else. Egyptian President Gamal Nasser gets on the phone with Jordan's King Hussein. Together, they come up with an explanation for their defeats. They accuse the US and Britain of fighting on Israel's side. But Israeli intelligence has taped the call. When U.S. diplomat Richard Parker hears the accusation over the radio, he calls Nasser's deputy.
I called up and said, what the hell is this? There aren't any American aircraft within 300 miles of Egypt. He said, for your information, they could not possibly have done what they did without help, and that help had to come from you or the British. And we think it was you.
The accusation about U.S. and British involvement ricochets around the Arab world and feeds a growing resentment against the West. From the outset, President Johnson has tried to stop the fighting. He also wants a post-war policy that would bring a more lasting peace. But first, he has to get the UN Security Council on board.
A normal United Nations Security Council resolution in a situation like this after a war or an attack would be ceasefire and withdrawal of forces to their pre-war boundaries.
The Soviets want a ceasefire and a withdrawal. But Johnson accepts Israel's argument that they should not withdraw and that the captured territories be exchanged for peace. In the corridors of the UN, intense negotiations take place. The Soviet Union is so alarmed at the speed of Arab losses that it's ready to accept a quick agreement and avoid the complete destruction of the Arab armies. The Soviets, therefore, agree to a ceasefire with no withdrawal, even though Israel is now in possession of large swaths of Arab land. To Johnson's dismay, Egypt and Syria refuse to accept the proposal. But this principle of exchanging land for peace becomes the American policy in the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Nobody sat down and said the position of the United States for the next 40 years will be no Israeli withdrawal until there's peace. We're still, 40 years later, dealing with the consequences of that decision.
The Egyptian army, though battered, remains a formidable fighting force. 9 of its 14 divisions have not yet seen combat and could be used to block the Israeli drive to the Suez Canal. Amer, however, has no fight left in him. He wants to withdraw. But when his generals submit a plan that will take 3 days to implement, he panics and orders the army to get out of the Sinai immediately.
The withdrawal was not planned. A planned withdrawal means an orderly retreat to specific positions. The withdrawal orders were issued without details, and the local commanders were left alone to execute them. It resulted in a lot of confusion on the Sinai front.
The Egyptian army took a month to move into the Sinai, and now they are trying to escape in a day. Amer's withdrawal order is intercepted by the Israelis, and they set a trap. There are 100,000 Egyptian soldiers and hundreds of tanks to be captured or destroyed.
Instead of the original plan of attack, we decided to encircle the Egyptian army. We knew they had a withdrawal order, and so they would have to find a way to break out of this encirclement. Rather than attack them, we were waiting for them to come to us.
Fatih Abu el-Rish has been retreating on foot for over 24 hours.
We were walking in groups of 3 or 4. We knew the roads because we had spent 3 years in this area. As we walked, we looked in broken down cars for food or water. Everyone was looking to the sky. We were afraid that there would be an airplane coming to attack us. No one was thinking about anyone else, only about himself.
Yehoshua Bar Dayan writes in his diary,
I am driving over bodies. There are human limbs, one after another. I'm driving over the face of an Egyptian soldier. His nose is sticking up, and his eyes are open. I am searching for a word that will describe the sight. It is the total destruction of the Egyptian army.
Tens of thousands of Egyptians are taken prisoner. An Israeli soldier near the airport of El Arish captures this on film. As the numbers become overwhelming, the Israelis decide to keep only officers and specialists and let the others go.
There was chaos until we got to the banks of the Suez. The Israelis told us, go back home. They captured a huge amount of soldiers and were detaining about 20,000 people, but then they let them go.
Tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers are going home with tales of defeat and destruction. There will be no more cheering crowds, no easy lies about victories. By late afternoon, Nasser meets with his senior officers, including Field Marshal Amer. Distraught, the officers leave the two men alone. Nasser comes out with an ashen face and says, "Everything is over. We're agreeing to a ceasefire."
He was very sad. He reiterated what he said to me. If I knew the army was incapable of military confrontation, I would have avoided it. I am a chess player. I can play politics. I didn't have to go to war.
With his army destroyed, Nasser decides to face his nation. He justifies his road to war and admits that the Egyptian army has suffered a terrible defeat. But he avoids responsibility and blames the US and Britain for helping Israel. He then stuns his countrymen and the Arab world by resigning as president.
أيها الإخوة، لقد تعودنا معا في أوقات النصر وفي أوقات المحنة، في الساعات الحلوة وفي الساعات المرة، أن نجلس معا وأن نتحدث بقلوب مفتوحة، أن نتصارح بالحقائق.
أذكر مصور تلفزيون.
I remember the cameraman was crying.
الكاميرا اهتزت.
The chief cameraman had to take over for him in order to continue the broadcast.
Nasser has barely finished his speech when thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, many organized by his political party, fill the streets, crying, shouting, begging their leader to stay.
We heard it on the radio. We wanted to go to Cairo and to tell him, no, don't resign. He had to stay. It's like your son has done something wrong and is trying to avoid responsibility. You have to deal with the matter and correct your mistake.
Not only the Egyptians took to the street, but all Arabs everywhere. He received calls from other presidents asking him to stay.
Hours later, Radio Cairo announces that Nasser will not resist the voice of the people. He says that he will remain in office until the traces of Israel's aggression are eradicated.
In all the countries in the world that went through similar experiences, the governments fell. But not the Arab regimes. That's the situation I had to face, as well as millions of other citizens. Here we were, left in the middle of a path, a deserted, dry path. Not a cloud in the sky, no promise of rain. We were left with the ruins of our dreams.
In the first 4 days of war, Israel defeats Egypt and Jordan. Moshe Dayan did not want the army to reach the Suez Canal, but now Israelis are cooling in its waters. Dayan had been against the occupation of the old city of Jerusalem. Who needs this Vatican, he said. But now Israel controls all of Jerusalem. Dayan was reluctant to respond to Syrian shelling in the north because of the possibility of involving Syria's powerful ally, the Soviet Union. But on the 5th day of war, Dayan changes his mind and orders an attack on Syria.
Dayan once told me that Israel is like a small mouse. There's a big ocean in which all the superpowers swim. They're the big fish, whales, dolphins. And Israel is like a small mouse. It runs quickly out of its hole to grab something and runs quickly back to the hole.
Israel attacks all along the Syrian border. Dayan's goal is to control the strategic Golan Heights and silence Syrian guns once and for all. His action brings the world to the brink of global war. That evening, the hotline in the White House comes to life. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin sends a stern warning.
Kosygin, in a sense, said to the president, if you want war, you're going to get war. He didn't actually use those words. He said, in effect, if you don't stop this action, that is to say, if you don't stop Israel attacking Syria, we will have to respond and we will consider, I think his words were, unilateral military action.
The situation was very serious on a global scale. No one knew what turn events might take. You know, Middle East conflict has always been like a powder keg. There might have been an explosion with grave consequences for the whole world.
The Soviets move to back up their threat. They order Air Force General Vasily Reshetnikov to repaint his planes with Egyptian Air Force markings and prepare for action.
I was told to get my air squadrons ready, to equip the airplanes with bombs, and to be ready to strike military and communications targets in Israel.
Less than 10 miles from the Israeli shores, the Soviet fleet is assembling a force to storm the Israeli port of Haifa. Captain Yuri Kripunkov is asked to find volunteers to go ashore for battle.
I lined up my boys on the deck and said, "Lads, it seems like we're going to take part in a very serious action. Those who are not ready to risk their lives should step ahead." Only one stepped ahead.
As the news of Soviet military preparations streams into the Situation Room in Washington, the U.S. makes military preparations of its own. It is the most dangerous moment of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
We feared we would have to introduce U.S. military force to support Israel defending itself against a combination of Syria and the Soviet Union. The Sixth Fleet was then steaming on a training exercise in the Mediterranean toward Gibraltar. We turned it around and sent it back toward Israel, not to support an Israel attack on Syria, but to be prepared to defend Israel against a potential Soviet attack. Very, very dangerous.
In the United Nations, Syria presses for an immediate ceasefire, but Israel resists. This buys Dayan enough time to finish what he's started. In the next few hours, the Syrian army is decimated. The Israelis push to within 40 miles of Syria's capital, Damascus, when Dayan calls a halt and Israel agrees to a ceasefire.
I remember taking in my car a soldier who was walking back home from the front. He was crying. I asked him, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "I would have preferred to have both my legs amputated than to return home in such defeat."
After only 6 days, the war is over. Israelis feared the worst, and now they are filled with relief. The political geography of the region has dramatically changed. Israel now controls 3.5 times as much land as it had 6 days ago. Prime Minister Eshkol, who didn't want the war, governs 1.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But it is Jerusalem that is both the biggest prize and the thorniest issue. In Old Jerusalem, the Israelis feel they've liberated their ancient capital, and they are quick to make their presence known. The war ends at 6 p.m. That same night, the Israeli army begins to alter the city.
I start hearing noise coming up from the Magana quarter. And I see there are bulldozers. And they're starting to destroy houses. And in the morning, I get a better look. Half the quarter is destroyed.
For generations, Jews who wanted to pray at the Wailing Wall had to do so in a narrow alley. But now, Diane wants to remake this quarter into an open plaza that can hold thousands. The Wailing Wall is to be transformed from a religious site into a national symbol.
When I saw this destruction, there was a part of me that felt tremendous dread, that like a whole new problem was going to be created, a whole new problem.
But for the moment, Israelis are triumphant. Thousands go to Jerusalem to celebrate and give thanks. They feel they have been saved from destruction. Yet many want more than a short-term victory.
What would you like to see happen now? Would you like to see all the land that's been gained kept by Israel?
No, I would like to see peace.
Oh, I think there may be a chance for peace now with the Arabs, yes, of course.
We were in a state of shock those first few days. For the first time, people could visit Jerusalem and the territories. It was as if all politicians, from the right and left, and all the people, had taken a large dose of LSD, and we were flying.
While the Israelis are celebrating, the Palestinians are devastated. The rest of Palestine has fallen into Israeli hands.
I decided to cross the River Jordan. I had relatives in Nablus, in Jerusalem, in Ramallah. The people were not only shocked, it was more than shock. People were, as I told you, influenced, enticed by the propaganda war to feel that victory was at hand. To be defeated in such a humiliating way was something beyond anybody's imagination.
Almost immediately, the Israeli government begins to plan for peace. Israel offers to give back Sinai and the Golan in exchange for full peace with Egypt and Syria. It is willing to negotiate over the West Bank, but insists on keeping all of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
Diane and Eshkol stated that they were willing to give a lot back for peace, and Diane said his famous line, that he's waiting for a telephone call from the Arabs. And the Arabs, instead of calling Diane, went to Khartoum.
1 month after the war, Arab leaders gathered for a meeting in Khartoum, Sudan, to deal with the aftermath of the war. In spite of his horrendous defeat, Nasser is still the undisputed leader of the Arab world. He rejects the land for peace concept promoted by the Soviets and the Americans as being tantamount to a surrender. Instead, the conference decides on the 3 no's: no recognition of Israel, no peace, and no negotiations. And all Arab states are to prepare for military action. In the years after the war, Egypt and Jordan do sign peace agreements with Israel. The Palestinians and Israelis are still in painful negotiations. The Arab League has accepted the principle of land for peace. But 40 years later, the war is still with us. Its results are embodied in every aspect of the bloody Middle East conflict. Both the victors and the vanquished are still searching for its meaning.
תראה, אנחנו נטע זר, זה לא יועיל.
We are a foreign implant, and around us are hundreds of millions of others, and nothing will change that. It is not a solution to depart from here and give them the country. And if we don't leave here, this conflict will not end very soon.
Israeli horizon, you see, is only to the next battle. Because if they lose one battle, they're gone.
We tried to understand why. We were deceived. They lied to us. The only objective of the Arabic regimes was to stay in power, nothing else. Our institutions were incapable of dealing with this catastrophe. Our governments showed only a short-term view, a lack of organization, corruption. What fell is the political government class in the Arab world.
We thought we were strong, politically, militarily, economically, culturally, and even creatively. Suddenly, with the war of 1967, we found ourselves at the edge of a pit, the edge of a vacuum. Our institutions were incapable of dealing with this tragedy.
So all right, Nasser made a mistake and Hussein made a mistake. So why do we have to fall into the trap of their mistake and to turn our lives into an ongoing hell? 40 years we have been living in an ongoing hell because of this accursed occupation.